Hi, and welcome to Old Canyon Forge. My name is Dan Rotblatt. Today we're going to do the third part in our series of Knife Making 101, how to make a knife with the minimal of equipment. It's really for beginners starting out in the craft. Want to just give it a try. We'll be making this fine blade here. We've already ground the knife and made the shape, and we've heat treated it. So in this video we're going to be finished sanding it and putting on the handle, sharpening it. It'll be done, and this is the result. So let's get started and finish up this knife.
We'll start sanding our knife using 120 grit sandpaper and a wood block. We're going to clamp the knife to a piece of wood, being very careful that the tip does not overhang the end of the piece of wood. That gets kind of dangerous when you're sanding, and you'll see why later. We use 2 C-clamps, just like we did when we're cutting or grinding the blade, and secure the knife to the wood. We'll measure a piece of 120 grit sandpaper to the length of the block, and that block is just a piece of scrap wood I had. You can fold the sandpaper a few times and rip it. It'll rip fairly evenly. Then wrap the sandpaper around the block, and we're ready to start sanding. We're going to use a little water on the blade. The reason for this is it prevents the sandpaper from clogging up, and that's why we use wet and dry sandpaper. As you can see, we're sanding down the length of the blade. This is why it's clamped to a piece of wood, so that tip is not exposed. If we were to miss, say pull back too far in the sandpaper so it slides off the blade, it's so easy to stab yourself on that blade. Don't ask me how I know, but Band-Aids are always available in my studio. Looking at the blade, you can see dark vertical lines. These are deeper grind marks from when we were working before. We're going to have to sand these all out. We want that blade to look just one silver color. And the initial sanding will go pretty fast. You'll get 99% of this sanded fairly quickly. It's that last 1% that's the hardest, because you have to take away the entire surface, bring the entire surface down to get rid of it. Not only am I doing the blade bevel, but I'm doing the ricasso as well, making sure the sandpaper is flat to the handle. Once we get all the grind marks out, we're going to move up to 240 or 280 grit sandpaper. And once we get all the 120 grit marks out, we'll move up to 400 grit to get all the 240 or 280 marks out. And we'll just leave the knife at 400 grit for this one. You can go further and go up to a 600 or a 1200 grit, or even just polish it after that. Be sure while you're on the 120 grit, you get all the grind marks out. It's really a pain when you go up to 400 and you find some deep scratches and you have to go back to 120 again and redo all your work. So do this part really carefully. Make sure you've gotten everything out. Now that we've finished the 120, we're going to move to 220, which is the grit I had available. We just add a little more water, and now it's just rinse and repeat, trying to get all those 120 marks out. By changing the angle of the sanding, I'm doing it on a 45 right now, we can see those 120 grit marks much easier, and you can see what you're getting out. It goes fairly quickly if you've gotten everything, all the grind marks out. As the sandpaper dulls, be sure to rip off that piece and start a new fresh section. The saying among knife makers is use sandpaper as if it was free. Now we'll go to our finest sandpaper, 400 grit, and here we'll sand parallel with the blade, which is at a 45-degree angle to what we did the 220 at. This way we'll see all the 220 sand marks and be able to get those out. Once more, if you've done a good job on the 220, the 400 won't take that long. I'm going to finish here by doing strokes in one direction, starting at the plunge line, just to make all our sand marks nice and even and look really nice. Here you can see the nice satin finish we've created. If you want to go further, you can go up to 600 or 1200 grit sandpaper, or take it to a nice polish. Now, if you think we're done sanding, we're not. There's several other things we have to do to finish up. We have the handle to get the scale off, and we want to sand the spine and make that look really nice. You want to be really careful, especially sanding at this speed, because the tip, as you can see, is sticking up there, and we've got to make sure we don't skewer ourselves on it. And finally, some work on the base of the ricasso next to the choil, just to buff that out. I'm going to go through a few grits of sandpaper on it, just like I do on the rest. The one thing I'm not going to do is the edge of the knife around the handle. The reason for this is when we sand the handle, all that metal will get sanded and finished. Well, that completes all the sanding work we're going to have to do on the metal itself, on the knife. As I mentioned earlier, you're welcome to go further, buffing the knife or doing a 1500 grit satin finish. It all depends on how much work you want to put into it. Now we're ready to put on the handle and finish the knife. Since we did all that work on the blade, it's a good idea to protect it, so we're going to cover it with little blue painter's tape. Masking tape will work. Pretty much any tape you have will work. This just comes off easiest. The handle material I'm going to use is a piece of walnut shelving that I had sitting around. It's an end off a shelf that I shortened. Any hardwood will work just fine. Maple, walnut, you name it. There's a plethora of woods out there that work just fine. You can also buy wood online. There's stabilized wood, which prevents it from shrinking and expanding. As long as it's well seasoned, it'll be just fine. So as you can see, I've marked where I want the front of the handle to be on my knife. Laid it out on the wood, and now I'm just tracing the outline of the handle onto the wood. And now I'm just making kind of a straight line. This is going to be what my cut is. We want to leave about an 1/8 inch extra wood around the entire handle. We can easily file or sand that off later, and it'll make it a lot easier when we drill the holes. We don't have to be as precise. You can always take off wood, you can't add it. Here I'm just making sure I have a straight line, just using a straight edge. And then I'm going to just take a hacksaw and have at it. Cut as straight as you can. We're going to be taking off a lot of material later. Next we need to split our wood so our knife will fit in there like a salami in a sandwich. And so I'm going to use our dividers to make two lines, just like we found the center of our blade. Then I'll mark it down those scored marks with a Sharpie, best I can. And this gives me a good, easy line to follow. The straighter this line is, the less work we're going to have later. I want to do it on both sides so that when I cut that line, the two sides are of even thickness. Our next job is to flatten these two sides we just cut. So you see why getting them even is very important. We're using some 80 grit garnet paper. This is just standard wood paper. This is not done wet. And I'm just putting it on a flat surface and sanding the inside face until it's reasonably smooth. It does not have to be perfect. The epoxy will fill some small gaps, but you want to get it pretty close. Periodically check to see how close you are by putting the two slabs together. You can see any gaps if you put them together. If you put a light behind it, you'll see it a lot easier. Try to keep pressure in the middle of the slab. If you hold it to one end or the other, you're going to just thin out those ends. Try to keep it really flat and don't rock it while you sand. Before we go any further, we want to drill the holes into the slabs. We want to do this in a very particular order in order to make them line up. First, we align the first slab onto the knife and clamp it with a C-clamp. We're going to need our pins for aligning in this operation, so we're going to just cut a few pieces of our brass rod, our pin stock, to the right size with a pair of needle nose. And deburr the ends with a file. Then we'll give it a test fit just to make sure that they fit properly. Next, we're going to drill the first hole. By going through the handle slab, we know that that hole is going to be aligned with the handle. A drill press would be better for this, because what we don't know is if that drill is going straight down or not. Irregardless of whether we use a drill press or not, we know that using this method, the holes will line up. Now we're going to take one of the pins, insert it in the hole, and holding the handle in place, relocate the clamp so we can drill the second hole. Because the pin is in the hole, we know this first hole is going to remain aligned. Once the handle is clamped, we can drill this second hole. Now to drill the second slab. We're going to put the pins in so that first slab will be aligned with the holes on the knife. Next, we'll line up the slabs by eye. Remember, we have a little extra wood around the entire handle. I'll remove the first pin now that it's clamped and drill right down through the handle slab through the first hole, which will act as a guide to make sure that that drill drills a perfectly aligned hole. We put the first pin back, remove the second one, and holding the first pin in place, drill it again. And as we can see, both holes are perfectly aligned. Then I mark a X on the two slabs just so I know which one's which, just so I don't make the mistake of reversing them. It's so easy to do. We're almost ready to glue the handle slabs to the knife, but we have to do one more thing. Once they're glued and attached to the knife, we can't get to the front of the handle slabs. So what we're going to do now is finish those two front ends. The very first thing I have to do is a little layout, figuring out where and what shape I'm going to want that front to be. Now I already drew it on the knife, but since I can't draw through the knife, I'm just going to have to fake it. So once more, we're going to trace the knife handle onto the slab, onto the inside of the slab, and I'm going to mark where I want the end to be. And then I'm going to just sketch it in. All we'll do is one side. We'll just match the other side to it once it's cut and shaped. The slab is put in the vise, and we'll just chop off that end. Now we'll reposition for filing, and using the coarse bastard file, a crosscut file, we're going to file it off to shape. Right now we're going to go with a flat shape just to get the profile right, and then we're going to put a bevel on it. Once that is done, it really doesn't take long. Unlike metal, the wood files off very quickly. Here we're starting to file a bevel onto this handle slab. It's basically the same kind of motion, but I'm just working it on an angle. If you watch the top left face, right next to the bevel, you can see where a line is formed. And by watching that, I can keep myself aligned to make sure I get that bevel all the way to the edge and pretty even. Here the first side is rough filed, and you can take a look and see what it looks like a little bit. Now what we're going to do is match up the two handles and work on the second side. We match up the two handles, trace the line, clamp it in the vise, and cut it off with a hacksaw. From there, we're just going to match up the two handles with the pins in them and file it off to shape. The wood will tend to clog up the teeth on the file, so occasionally use a little wire brush or a file card to clean it up. Once we finish the rough filing, we're going to go ahead and sand the front. We're going to want these totally finished down to 400 grit. So we'll start with an 80 grit garnet paper, and then we'll move ourselves up to a 400 in steps, 120, 240, 400. The front of the handle slabs are sanded down to a 400 grit, which gives a nice finish, but the open end grain of the wood is not good. So what we're going to do is seal it with a little Loctite. Right now I'm taking a little acetone and wiping them off. You can use some alcohol too. That'll work fine. And then I'm going to take a little Loctite and put it on a Q-tip. And we're going to use that to just cover the ends, and that'll seal the wood off. We'll have to sand them again after this, but it'll soak into that open grain and seal the wood. Okay, now we're going to go another round with the 400 grit sandpaper. The Loctite creates a surface which is kind of like plastic. So what we're going to end up getting, as you'll see when we finish with the 400, is kind of a dull finish. So I'm going to do another round after that with a 1500 grit to bring out a nice satin finish on it and a nice sheen to the wood. You could do this same process for the entire handle later. You can see we've got a nice sheen on the wood now. I could take this up to a 2000 or 3000 grit, or I could buff it and get a real polish on it. Now that we've got the front of the handle slabs polished, we're ready to glue. Very first thing is to have everything available. We'll need alcohol in order to clean off everything and make sure there's no oils or fingerprints on the handle. We need our glue, and for this I'm using a 15-minute epoxy, which I got from True Grit, but you can use any good 2-part epoxy. Need some popsicle sticks, some little container to mix the epoxy in. We need the pins, which you can see right next to the knife there, some C-clamps, and some sort of resist. I use Vaseline, works very well. Before we start mixing the glue, we're just going to fit everything up to make sure everything fits right and we know how everything goes together. While it's together, I'm going to take a little Vaseline and run it on the bare part of the blade and on the front of the handle. This will prevent the glue from sticking to that portion of the handle. We put a lot of work into it, we don't want to ruin it. I'm also careful to get the Vaseline off my fingers so I don't transfer that back onto the handle that we've cleaned off so nicely. Next, I'm just going to use the wire cutter portion of the pliers to make some little divots in the pin. The reason for this is to give the glue something to grab onto on the pin. We clean off the pins with a little alcohol, and now we're ready to glue. Mix equal amounts of the hardener and resin into a container. Mix up a little more than you think you're going to need. Nothing worse than running short. Now take a popsicle stick and mix your 2 parts very thoroughly. Take a bit of extra time mixing. You want to get it really mixed up well. I'll speed this up, but I mixed for a full 30 seconds. Note how I'm getting into all the little corners too. Using a popsicle stick, I spread the epoxy both on the handle slab and the steel on the knife. You want to get a good, complete spread on the surface, as you can see here. And I highly recommend wearing rubber gloves when doing this. Due to COVID, I don't have any because they're hard to get hold of and expensive. Dip the end of the pins in the epoxy before inserting them in the holes. We do both sides of the handle here because it'll be hard to get to that second side after we put it on the pins. And now we do the other handle slab. A little epoxy on the pins. We want those to hold nicely. Get your choice of C-clamps, or you can buy some cheap spring clamps. Those work really nice. Now a little alcohol on a rag and we'll wipe off the epoxy off the front of the bolsters. If you forget to do this, the Vaseline that we put on will allow you to take it off later. Push the pins in a little bit, or tap them in. Just make sure there's plenty of epoxy on both sides in the holes. That whole process took 4 minutes, so you can see why 5-minute epoxy would be a problem. I'm going to use a little alcohol just to clean up my hands, since I didn't wear gloves. Now the slabs are glued and we just have to wait for the epoxy to set up. A few hours would do, but we're going to leave it overnight. Now that the epoxy is set, we need to cut off the pins and start shaping the handle. I'm going to use the hacksaw to cut off our pins. Once the pins are removed, we're going to clean up what's left with the file. We'll clamp it in the vise and be really careful to not put too much pressure on the clamp, just enough to hold it. We don't want to damage the wood. The file we want to use on wood is a coarser file, so a 8-inch bastard will work quite well on this. You can see it makes really quick work of smoothing out those pins. Now that we've got the sides flattened out, we're going to just start working on the profile. One thing that will happen with the wood is that it will clog the file. Metal does this too, and so you want to use a file card or a small wire brush to periodically clean your file off. There's no reason we can't speed this up a little bit, so I'm going to grab the flap disc. This is the 120 grit wheel that I'm using here, but there's no reason why you can't use a 60 grit. You want to grind the wood down and just until you hit the metal, and you can see that as soon as I've removed the wood, the metal shows up real bright. So just bring it down to where you've got the wood gone and that metal just showing up. You'll also see some sparks as soon as it hits the metal. Use a light touch. You don't want to burn the wood, and it can do that. For some reason, I've chosen to use a file for the back of the handle, maybe just to see the difference in time. It took me the same time to do the 1 inch on the back of the handle here with the file as it did to do the entire back of the handle, 5 inches, with the flap disc. Here I'm just finishing up that last little bit and smoothing off the file marks. Another way to remove a lot of wood is to just take the hacksaw and cut it off. Be careful not to cut into your handle when you're doing this. I'm taking a little bit off and then cutting down and cutting that off so I can change the angle easily. Hacksaws don't allow you to make a very good curved cut, so I'm making little straight cuts. Now we're just going to clean up that profile, that last cut with the file, and then I'll run a flap disc on there to clean up those marks. Once that's done, we're just going to rotate between a file and the flap disc and start shaping the blade just to fit our hand. And really it's kind of an aesthetic thing. you'll want to work it so it fits your hand comfortably. I spend about 20 minutes shaping the handle this way, so we'll just speed it up a little bit more. The first thing I'm doing is taking a little off this slab because it's thicker than the other slab. So we're getting them both even. Once the two slabs are of even thickness, I'm going to put the knife in so the handle is sticking out, and then I'm going to knock off the corners. Basically, I'm creating an octagonal profile. I could leave it this way or round it, which is what I'm going to be doing. Mainly it gives me a visual reference so I can keep the shape even. I want the handle to taper towards the front, or basically be a little thinner in the front than the back. So we're just going to take off a little on the front two sides. A little careful measurement and some adjustment. I'll periodically check to see how it feels, and then go back to adjusting. Here I'm starting to round the handle. I also like the back to be a little bit rounded, so I'm going to work on that too. And there we go, we're pretty much done. Give it a feel, use your fingers, your tactile sense will be much better than your eyes. Give it a good feel, see if it feels right in your hand, if there's any hot spots or places where it's rubbing. And next we're going to move on to sanding. I'm going to be using Watco Danish oil, or you can use a linseed oil or mineral oil even, and wet and dry sandpaper. The oil will keep the sandpaper from clogging up. Be very careful of oily rags if you put any, wipe your hands off or pour any on a paper towel. It can spontaneously combust, so put it in a bucket of water when you're done, or sometimes I'll stick them in my forge and just burn them. Make sure that they don't cause a fire hazard. We're starting with 120 grit sandpaper, and much like the metal, we'll go to a 220 and then a 400. The higher grit will even be better if we have that piece of 1200 we used before. You can go up to that after this if you want a really nice finish on it. Our goal with 120 is to get all those file marks out. Not only are we sanding the wood, but we need to sand the metal too, and we want it to match the rest. So we're going to use a block with a 120 grit sandpaper, since the block's more aggressive and will give us a similar finish to the rest of the knife. One of the sanding techniques I use is to place the paper kind of between my fingers like this. You'll see. There you go. And especially when I'm doing a convex surface, you can round things very nicely with this. Also holds the paper in place and doesn't rip up your hands, because paper can be kind of abrasive. I'm going to do the concave surface under the guard. And to do this, I'm going to use the half-round bastard file and wrap some paper around it. This will allow me to get to that inside surface I could have used a wood dowel or even my finger, although my finger is soft, so it would cause it to round the edges a little bit more. This will keep some sharp, crisp edges. We're pretty much finished up with the 120 grit. This is what we're looking like. Walnut's a really nice wood, especially with that Watco oil finish. A little bit more touch up, and then we'll move on to the next sandpaper. There we are, the 220 is completed, and now we'll do a round with the 400. With the 400 grit, we want to go with the grain. And there we are, now we're done. If we wanted to go to a 1200, we'd get a little finer sheen off of it. We could have also put some different coatings on it, but the Watco oil is a nice one for the walnut. And there's our finished blade. There's just one more thing that we really have to do. We have to give it an edge. We'll put a little WD-40 on a fairly inexpensive whetstone and kind of rough out the edge on this. We'll finish it after this on some sandpaper. You want about a 15-degree angle from the stone. Our goal here is to get a rough edge on the entire length of the blade. This stone has a coarse side and a fine side, and we've started on the coarse, and we're going to flip it right here to the fine side and refine the edge a little bit. Once we've got that rough edge completed, we're going to go to a 400 grit sandpaper on some hard surface. I've got a block of steel under mine here, but a piece of smooth wood would work. The walnut shelving that we used for the handle is nice, and smooth wood would work really nicely. The goal here is to take out the rough grind marks and smooth out the edge. We're kind of polishing it somewhat. We're keeping that same exact angle, that 15-degree angle, maybe 18 if you want it a little more stout. You could certainly go to a finer grit like the 1200 to get an even finer edge after the 400.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed Knife Making 101, making this knife with minimal tools. If you learned anything or enjoyed it all, please press that like button and come see me at oldcanyonforge.com. I'm Dan Rotblatt, and thanks again for watching.